Good morning, and welcome to today's event on the state of higher education finances in 2021. My name is Mariette Aborn, and I'm a research analyst at BPC here. And the spread of COVID-19 and the resulting economic fallout have placed unprecedented financial strain on our higher education system. Enrollment is in flux, state and budgets are under increased pressure, and institutions are facing ballooning costs associated with virus management. In response to these challenges, Congress provided $14 billion in the CARES Act and another $21 billion in the December stimulus for the higher education system. Now, the Biden administration has proposed an additional $35 billion through the American Rescue Plan. Today's event will discuss the financial challenges that lay ahead for our higher education system, the potential to see additional colleges close, and some policy solutions to mitigate this fallout. We are grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for supporting this work, as well as today's event. So with that said, let me introduce our experts. I will keep these intros short, but their full bios are available on the events page on BPC's website. First, we have Armand Alakbay. He is the Vice President of Trustees and Government Affairs at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. We have Robert Telchin, an Associate Professor of Higher Education at Seton Hall University and the BPC Higher Education Fellow. Nadrea Njoku, a Senior Research Associate at the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute at UNCF. And finally, Belle Whelan, the President of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. We're grateful to our panelists and experts for joining us today too. And we hope you will participate in today's conversation by tweeting your comments or questions at #BPCLive. Or if you are viewing this event in Zoom, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature. And we will save about the last third of today's time for the panelists to answer your questions directly. So with that, let's get started. Robert, I think as we begin, I think it could be helpful to lay out a little context. So could you provide us an overview of what these broad financial challenges are facing the higher education system this year, and also give us some context for how we got here?
Sure. So colleges rely on 4 different revenue sources, and the reliance varies some across colleges. The primary source for many colleges is tuition, and tuition has been negatively affected. If nothing else, colleges have had a hard time increasing tuition, but enrollment in much of higher education has dropped, and colleges have struggled to get the same amount of revenue coming from students. So they've given out tuition discounts to try to get students to attend. That's been affected across most colleges. The second source is the revenue you get from having people on campus. That can be room and board, it can be athletics, it can be facilities rentals. Those sources crashed from business as usual about 1 year ago today to 0 within 3 weeks after that. And many colleges, even the ones with people on campus, have struggled to bring that source back to 100% with reduced density. The third source is state funding for higher education for public colleges and universities. So far, that's turned out, I would say, better than expected. It's still under pressure in many states, depending on their exact tax structure, but income tax revenue has been fairly strong. Other revenue sources like tourism taxes have not been strong, and that varies considerably once again across states. And the final revenue source that colleges count on is funding from gifts, donations, endowments. So far, that's held out fairly well through this, but who knows what could happen if the pandemic doesn't dissipate in the next few months. Will the economy stay strong enough for donors to continue opening their pocketbooks? And on the expense side, colleges have spent untold sums of money on plexiglass, on hand sanitizer, on signage, also on virus testing. That has cost larger universities millions of dollars. And all that money has added up. So that's how we got into this situation. But it's also longer term trends about concerns about enrollment, funding, and financial stability, this crisis just accelerated many of those concerns.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. That's definitely helpful context as we begin this conversation. And so I'm going to pose a question to the group now. Congress has already spent billions of dollars to support higher education through the pandemic, and the Biden administration is proposing billions more in spending. Let's start with a Goldilocks question here. Are these allocations too much, too little, or just right?
I think it's hard to tell. I mean, things are probably a lot more predictable than they were a year ago right now as far as what the future of the financial outlook will be, but there's still a lot of enough unknowns to be concerned. So student mental health, and I'm sure those I see a lot of incoming costs there that we can't estimate at this point. I hate to give the non-answer here, but it really is too early to tell.
I was going to say, as the answer to that question, because for some institutions it is enough, for some it's not enough, and for some it's just right. It depends on the financial state they were in before the pandemic. But I think definitely had the federal dollars not come through, our institutions would have been up a creek without a paddle, no doubt about it.
Robert or Andrea, would you like to jump in?
Well, I'll say that I absolutely agree with the rest of the esteemed panel that these funds were definitely right on time for our institutions as they face this pandemic. But particularly for UNCF institutions, it was critical that they come through and supply our institutions with the funds to innovate in a pandemic season for the students that they're responsible for.
And I would say that the amount of money that's come in is nowhere near what colleges have lost in terms of lost revenue, but colleges have made up a fair amount of their budget gaps through cutting expenses. And the big debate going forward is going to be giving money to colleges or giving money to students. So far, the relief packages have split the difference, but how much longer will Congress be willing to fund colleges directly instead of giving the money through colleges to student financial aid?
Great, thank you. Belle, to follow up a little, you indicated that for some institutions it's too much, some too little, some just right. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you are hearing from your member institutions about how they are dealing with the financial challenges of the pandemic?
Sure. For several of our institutions, I say several, probably 1%, they were not prepared to provide instruction online. And so some of those dollars were great to come in and provide enough starter money for them to get the technology necessary to be online. It wasn't that many, but it was enough that their enrollment was in jeopardy anyway. And so this would have made it worse. And then going in, with all the PPP stuff and sanitizing everything, those were additional expenses that some of that federal money helped. For those institutions that had endowments they could borrow from, then it wasn't as much of a dire consequence. But for those that don't have heavy endowments, it was much appreciated. Add to that the fact that students decided to stay home in many cases, whether they were in residential institutions or commuter institutions. And so enrollments dropped, which meant revenue dropped. And so those things on which they had built a budget were going to be in jeopardy, on top of the fact that they had now COVID expenses. And so it has been interesting to listen to institutions talk about how they were saved on one hand, but they were still in limbo on another. And so you still had programmatic cost cuts, you still had faculty and staff cuts because if the students aren't there, then you don't need the personnel in order to run that. And so it's between March and May, it was just a zoo because they had already put budgets in place for the spring semester. They had already signed contracts with adjunct faculty, and now enrollment's dropping, and students are asking for refunds because they're not on campus. And oh my God, for the first time in my life, I was glad I was no longer on a campus because that was just a mess to have to deal with. The federal dollars that came in at that point saved everybody. I mean, there's just no doubt about that because it gave them a lifeline, from which to find some stability. Then in the summertime, it gave institutions an opportunity to figure out, okay, what are we going to do now? And how do we progress further? And they were able to make the necessary cuts and rearrange the scheduling and, not count on food service contract money coming in or dormitory fees coming in or athletic fees or whatever. They were able to get started with that fall semester in a much better condition. Then the December stimulus that came in, helped them because they didn't know what was going to happen into spring. Now I think there is a feeling is, okay, you've had a year to deal with this now. Let's just get back to business as usual with how do I deal with enrollment drops? How do I deal with rising cost of concrete and steel? How do I deal with blah, 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 blah. So it was panic city there for a while, but I think everybody has now been able to at least get back in a situation where they have time to think about what it is that they're going to do and to actually go back to their strategic plan and see what they can afford to delay.
Thank you so much, Belle. And Nadrea, a follow up with a similar question for you. Can you talk about the financial strains facing HBCUs in particular and how these institutions have used the emergency funds?
Sure. I will also start with Belle reminded me of a feeling I had when the pandemic first started. I was a student and then a staff member at Xavier University of Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina. And initially, the pandemic felt a lot like that situation. And, here is insurmountable challenge for small private liberal arts institutions inside of one city. And how do we use what we have to innovate and provide for our students in the midst of such an unfortunate circumstance? However, the pandemic is different in that there is nowhere to retreat to. There are nowhere to send students while we figure it out. Everyone is impacted. And so some of the financial strains that our institutions have been facing are the same strains that they were facing prior to the pandemic, as was outlined in a previous comment. But these funds that they received has allowed them to address some of those longstanding issues, but also innovate in the midst of the pandemic. What we are seeing and what members are talking about and what I am seeing in the field, and now the field used to be me traveling to institutions to collect information, but now we're existing in a virtual space. We are hearing that institutions are facing some of the, common issues that rural environments are facing, because a lot of our institutions are located in rural spaces. And, there's issues around connectivity, building a technological infrastructure to support students. How do we power and transform our institution from a residential space to a virtual platform if our students are not on campus? And our students fund the campus, so then how do we make space there? And also, how do we respond to our students' technological needs? If students are not on campus, how do we respond and help them with Wi-Fi where they are, if it's home or a shelter? How do we provide them with laptops so that they can attend the institution? And then second to that point, no matter where the institution is in the UNCF membership, they, no matter where they're located, these spaces are extremely student-centered and responsive to student needs. And as stated before, students are facing challenges with shelter, transportation from their institutions to home. At the beginning of the pandemic, we heard a lot of stories of institutions funding student transportation, whether or not that was on the road or by air? How do we get students away from campus where we perceive them to be in most danger to where they need to be, which is hopefully back with their families. So these are some things that they're continuing to face. And as we move into a new year, we're finding ourselves a year later, still in the same place with the pandemic. How are we going to help our students feel more secure around what they're facing and what we're facing as institutions, particularly around what that means for their education and their mental health?
Great, thank you so much. And you touched on this a little bit when you said that, the financial strains facing HBCUs predated the pandemic. And so I wanted to hear from you a little bit more about, even in light of this emergency funding, what holes still remain?
Institutions that are not, who cannot benefit from large endowments, the issue of growing an endowment, growing unrestricted funds remain. Those funds will support facilities, programs, but also emergency funds. What emergency funds do we have to support what's coming next? And those things that are coming next, we have no full grasp of. But I think, we are the issues that our institutions are facing, we aren't necessarily aware of just yet because they're so student responsive. Our students come from a community, primarily a Black community, and that is the community that's been one of the communities that's been hit the hardest by the pandemic. They are losing family members. They are losing parental and their support networks that they rely on outside of the institution. So as we learn more about what they're facing and what their needs are, we're learning more about what our needs are and how we can be responsive as institutions.
Great, thanks so much, Nadrea. And Belle, to follow up on that, are you hearing similar things from your members? What impact have these funds had on your member colleges?
Yeah. Her members are also my members. So yes, I'm hearing a lot of those same things, obviously, but even those institutions that are not HBCUs are, in the same situation as was mentioned earlier. Some of the issues that are here today were the same issues that were there previously. The good news for minority serving institutions is that in addition to, and this is going to sound strange as good news, but in addition to the pandemic, the social unrest has caused people to step up to the plate and pay attention to the fact that many minority serving institutions have been underfunded forever, either from lack of state funds that were not on par with the formulas that were used to fund predominantly white institutions, or just because, as was just said, students have larger needs that have been identified because the pandemic seems to be hitting the minority communities more or at higher rates than other communities. And so you've got the Bill Gates and the McDonald's and the all the major corporations that are now starting to step up to the plate and form partnerships with minority serving institutions, specifically HBCUs, to give tuition to students, to give scholarships, to start new programs, to do academic training. And these programs would have cost money for the institution to start on their own. And so it's good starter money to get them going. So if there's any bright light in any of this, I would think that was some of it. But those institutions, that were struggling before, it didn't make it worse because the federal money came through. Had the federal money not come through, then I think we might see some closures that we had not anticipated, because there's just no way that they could have accommodated all of the things that they were already dealing with, and then add the pandemic on top of it.
Thanks so much. We've heard a lot about how institutions had to, quickly adjust their education models in response to the pandemic and, move in many cases to remote learning. So Armand, I wanted to ask you, to what extent do these revenue shortfalls potentially give colleges the opportunity to adjust their financial models as well?
Sure. So I'll preface this with, it's impossible to paint higher education as a whole sector with a broad brush. So it's really going to depend by institution, but kind of the two things really jump out. The first is taking a hard look at capital expenditures. So during this pandemic, every industry has had to reckon in some way with how it views the use of real estate. Higher ed's no different. Pre-COVID, the trend for decades, though, has been for colleges and universities to invest in buildings. It's a part of the sector. In 2015, institutions in the U.S. spent about 11.5 billion, a record number, on construction, which included 21 million square feet of new space on top of the existing property. So, and it's not that this is even catching up with student enrollment; it's surpassing it. So, in a recent 10-year period, the total campus space grew by a full 10%. And these aren't just the proverbial climbing walls and lazy rivers, but also in many cases underutilized classroom space. ACTA studied 53 of the top-ranked public universities several years ago, and we found that most campuses, their scheduled rooms only between 25 and 35 hours per week, many below state recommended standards, with the drop-offs being on late afternoons and Fridays. And look, I'll attest to this. When I was an undergrad in the 90s, I was ruthless with making sure I didn't schedule classes on Fridays. So more recently, Louisiana passed a law several years ago requiring schools seeking state funding for capital projects to report classroom utilization rates disaggregated by day of week and time of day to try to get a handle on the scope of things. But really the point is just that buildings are expensive, energy and maintenance costs, even issues of environmental sustainability. So that there's a long way to go in coming up with creative, cost-effective solutions. But the uniqueness of this particular scenario, the pandemic, has really forced a lot of people to look at the space issue. And the second thing really is a renewed focus on public discussion about the return on investment in terms of student outcomes. So where does the money go, and how does that best promote student graduation rates, student learning? So when the Higher Education Act reauthorization was up in the House, 2019, I think, most recently, one of the amendments that passed in committee was that it would require colleges and universities to disclose publicly to both current and prospective students any annual increases in non-instructional spending of more than 5%. That same bill would have required a disclosure statement analyzing the extent to which any such increase would affect tuition without benefiting student instruction. Now, the weird thing about this is that amendment passed unanimously. 47-0. And as we're here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, these are the kind of discussions I think that are worth noting.
Thank you so much, Armand. To return to some of the comments earlier, these are challenges that impact some institutions more than others. And so, Nadrea, could you provide a little bit more context to your earlier comments about which types of institutions and consequently which types of students have been most impacted by these financial challenges?
I guess I don't want to inappropriately shine a light on one institution over the other. I think that I guess I'm closest to the conversations at this moment with the rural institutions that I've been talking to. For me, those institutions have faced interesting challenges because in those spaces, colleges and universities serve as an epicenter for the pulse of those communities. Not only does those institutions feed students who come from both urban and rural settings, but they fund those communities as well. Those will be the institutions that employ the professionals in that area. So if you don't, which was previously stated, if you don't have facilities to maintain, then you have people who have lost their jobs. And so I think that our UNCF institutions are both cognizant of the impact that they have on students, but also the role that they play in those communities. And so that is at top of mind for them. One of our presidents, Colette Pierce Burnett, she's the president of Houston-Tillotson. in Austin, and she talked about how low-income students are very expensive to educate because you're really doing justice work. You're doing work of filling gaps along their educational pathway to prepare them to be workforce and career ready. And so those students are the ones that we hope to dispatch to our cities, you know, our country internationally, who can contribute as citizens to make our, you know, our environments and the places that we occupy better. And so those are the institutions that I think of most, you know, the institutions that are access institutions, institutions that have to fill student gaps, not only educationally, but with soft skills. And a lot of those experiences come from the face-to-face synchronous environments that our residential institutions provide. And so those are the ones that I feel have been most impacted by the financial fallout. But I also want to draw attention to and continue to draw attention to students who have previously acknowledged that they face mental health issues, but their mental health issues will have become something that's on the surface for them in this time period. We distributed a pulse survey in connection with McKinsey at the start of the pandemic, and we collected more than 4,000 responses across 16 of our institutions. And I had the privilege of, I find my work to be a privilege, of evaluating the qualitative responses. So those are the open-ended questions that that survey collected. And the things that I found in those open-ended responses really, you know, hit me at the heart and at the core, in that these students, a lot of these students, you know, we naturally think, okay, if they can't be on campus because campus poses a risk in that, you know, they're all together and we can't control that space, we can send them home. And a lot of these students were not able to go home because the residential space for them was a retreat while they, you know, make this walk, make their pathway through the educational experience. And some of them found themselves on the couches of friends, in homeless shelters, trying to find a space because maybe their home environment wasn't as ideal as the residential experience that they were seeking and finding at these campuses. And, you know, HBCUs pride themselves in being the home away from home. So while there were some responses of relief, of safety, that, whew, I get to go home and be safe, there were an overwhelming response of students who stated that the campus itself was my virtue. It was my shelter away from a very perilous and unproductive environment. And I can't wait for the pandemic to be concluded so I can go back to what I knew. And I think it has been UNCF's value and our purpose to help institutions, or help to ensure that those institutions are there when the pandemic hopefully is done.
Thanks, Maria. It looks like Belle had something to jump in on. Go ahead, Belle.
Yeah. I also think that the recent articles in the higher ed regs have shown that community college enrollment has been impacted too because of the large adult population. The things that Andrea just mentioned, of students having to go home to help take care of a family, having an impact on student learning for those students, often results because parents then lose their job, or they're having to go out and find a second job, and they need somebody to come do childcare because students aren't there, the younger students aren't in school. And so my point is, I don't think you can identify any one particular group that you know, has been impacted more than the other, because they've all been impacted. You know, it was, as was indicated earlier, you know, adult students going back have lost their jobs perhaps, and so now they can't go back to school. Or you've got the younger students at home that the parents have been away from elementary school reading, writing, and math long enough that they need somebody who's closer to it to help those students. And so they tell their college children, you got to come back and help tutor this child. I mean, it's just impacting everybody.
And I have a follow-up Can I go?
Go ahead.
I have a follow-up comment really too, and I know that a lot of these conversations have been very sobering, but I do want to take a moment to shine a light on, some positive outgrowths of the funds that were distributed. So for instance, Wiley College, they have been able to redistribute the funds that they had for counseling and therapy to a virtual space called Wellness Wednesdays. And on Wednesday, their Associate Vice President, Ray Lundy, she oversees student health and wellness. She makes it a priority to provide Wednesday as a constant for these students. Well, to prioritize their wellness in a time where we can be very transparent and say wellness is at jeopardy, mentally, physically. The pandemic has hit us. And so, like Wiley, redistributing funds, refocusing, redirecting, and innovating in this time period, all of our institutions are finding the silver lining, the light in the midst of this, and figuring out ways to be most supportive. And although the residential space is not available to them to pull from as a resource for recovery healing in the midst of trying to learn, our institutions are finding ways, and Wiley is one example where we can rethink how we provide for our institution and our students.
Thank you so much to you both. Armand, going back to you, in the past, ACTA has been skeptical of boosting federal support for higher education, but earlier you spoke about how you felt like it was hard to answer the question about too much, too little, too right in terms of this pandemic relief. So I just wanted to get a better understanding of how ACTA thought about the support that higher education needs generally and then during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, skepticism is kind of, it's a hard word, but so ACTA, we want to see American higher education indisputably the finest in the world. So as I used to say, the envy of the world, and we do believe it's a public good, and that investment of public funds is entirely appropriate. I think it's making sure that part of that conversation in the use of public funds, or even honestly even just even tuition funds, is that it's being used in a way that that best benefits students. And really, it's looking at the role of institutional leadership making that decision, because really, trustees, boards, presidents, they're the ones that know their institutions better than the federal government will. So, I mean, actually, historically, the higher education sector has been remarkably resilient during economic downturns. So part of this is it's counter-cyclical. During bad business cycles, the opportunity cost of attending college drops, so people can focus on improving occupational prospects. So during the Great Recession, I think that the number of college enrollment went up from 17 million to 20 million over the course of the years of the recession and then immediately following. And many of those were folks that were not enrolled in any type of education system before. So, I mean, new entrants to post-secondary education. So it's not like we had influx of high school graduates. So now, none of this is to say that underperforming economies are good for higher ed. It's, I mean, obviously quite the contrary. I mean, we have all the issues we're talking about today, but what's different about now, I think, is that colleges and universities, I would argue, are getting the worst of both worlds with this economy. You get all the bad of an economic recession without the consolation prize of a marginal increase in enrollment. So, Bill, I think you mentioned the numbers of declining declining enrollments. So the latest numbers were 2.5% drop in fall 2020, and that's twice as much as the previous year. So 400,000 students out. Most of which in the two-year sector. Oddly enough, I think it was the four-year for-profits had the only sector to increase in enrollment. And the timing of all of this is just not ideal once you factor in the other parting gift of the Great Recession, which is the falling birth rates. So I think the predictions are the college-age population is expected to drop by 15% starting in 2025. So whatever one's position is on the idea of Bowen's law or the Bennett hypothesis that federal loan subsidies create some perverse incentive for institutions to increase expenditures and tuition, there are enough contributing factors overall that institutional leadership has to play a part in looking at how those costs are allocated. And that's really where the reason for our focus. We look at just what is it that boards can do for their institution.
Great. Thank you so much for providing that nuance. That's really helpful. Before we transition to a few last questions for the panel, just did want to remind the audience we have some questions that have been submitted, but you're welcome to tweet your questions using the hashtag BPC Live, or you can enter them using the Q&A feature in Zoom. So moving on, most of this discussion has focused on the sort of immediate consequences for the higher education system of COVID-19. So we'll switch to thinking longer term. Robert, what can we expect to be these long-term consequences for the higher education system?
So Armin mentioned the concerns about demographics going forward, and that the number of traditional age college students is scheduled to decline in the next few years. And then all of a sudden, the late 2030s don't look quite as good for the number of high school graduates because of this baby bust that's underway. And colleges have traditionally tried to grow their way out of issues. And that's harder to do now because they lost a lot of their financial runway over the past year, and they'll continue to do so for at least the next several months. And that's led colleges to make a number of cuts that they wouldn't have otherwise made. I mean, the idea of building new facilities is going by the wayside in many cases because colleges hesitate to take on additional expenses. And colleges are already using all of their expensive facilities as much as possible. I teach exclusively on evenings and weekends, and a lot of the expensive labs, things like that, get used well. Less expensive space, maybe not quite so much. But the challenge is if you're expecting enrollment to be steady or not thinking you can grow your way out, then you start thinking about cuts. A lot of colleges are considering cuts to programs, cuts to faculty. The idea of faculty tenure, I think, is slowly moving to where it will only be for superstars at the most elite institutions because colleges don't want to take on that time commitment, or not the time commitment, but the financial commitment here. And that's considerable. So colleges are going to be shell-shocked for a long period of time. They're going to be very cautious spending, and they're going to try to conserve their resources as much as possible.
Thanks, Robert. Belle, earlier you mentioned sort of this looming potential threat of college closures resulting from the pandemic. So I wanted to hear from you a little bit more about what your forecast is for college closures and to what extent might the pandemic escalate this trend?
I'm certainly not predicting foreclosures and nor am I wishing it on anybody, but I think the reality is we're going to have our fragile institutions considering merging with other institutions on one level, but then also, unfortunately, closing on another. If you don't have the students, if they don't change the demographics of their students and start recruiting adult students, for example, or if we can get our immigration laws such that we can re-invite immigrant students, to our campuses, then they're just not going to have the population to be able to compete. Many of our schools are older. They have facilities that are older, and students today are looking for bling. They want the best and the brightest. They want internet everywhere. They want big screen TVs in the dormitories. They want valet services. They want all those things. And when you have some institutions that are blessed enough to have those kinds of services, it's tough to compete against them. And so they're going to have to do something to do that. It has been interesting to me because I spent most of my career in community colleges, and we've been doing online instruction forever. But now senior institutions are beginning to go, oh, wow, we could do online and we could attract adult students. There's a novel concept. It's not a novel concept for me, but it is for many of our institutions. And I think that one of the things the pandemic has done is to cause institutions that have now had to go online to look and say, hey, this isn't all bad. Maybe we could use this to our advantage and, get students to continue to come who want a degree from our institution but can't travel or uproot their families to come and move to this community in order to get that. So I think that I'm hopeful that we've slowed down the number of institutions that will close because of the increased use of technology. But I am afraid that there are still going to be some that will fall by the wayside. And, you're looking at states like Connecticut, New Jersey, they're talking about merging all of their institutions in the state as one big institution. So that there are a lot of different ways of thinking about survival for our institutions than ever before.
Thanks, Belle. Robert, could you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to add to that. I mean, there are a lot of governing boards out there that are going to avoid closure. You have to be forward thinking on this, and I think there are a lot of people who trusteeship. It's a volunteer gig, but it's more than an honorary position. You actually have to look at what is the unique selling proposition of our institution? What's our brand? And this goes for public and private institutions. If you're a public institution, where do you fit in the scheme of the state if you're not seeking to merge into the larger system? If you're a private institution, what's the community that we serve? What are our stellar programs? How are we going to differentiate ourselves from the other 2,000 that are out there? So I mean, it's the whole necessity is the mother of invention kind of deal, but it's really, it falls on those who are heading those institutions to come up with who they are, figure out who they are.
Mm-hmm. I have a comment. I want to echo what Armand said. I think what I want to echo what Armand had said, in that what we have been pushing our institutions to do for quite some time is to devise a value proposition. What value do they bring to a community? And I think that is something that will be, like every issue that I've heard or we've talked about today, is an issue that we faced prior to the pandemic. However, the pandemic has, put a magnifying glass on that particular issue. Whatever your particular expertise is in higher education, your issue now is the big issue, because the pandemic has put a magnifying glass on that and more. But yes, value propositions. And then as we're talking about mergers, something that I want to bring to the table is the idea of shared services. Sharing services across institutions. Institutions can maintain their individualized traditions and identities, but also divide some of the responsive financial responsibility that they have across the institutions that they share communities with. I mean, we have two institutions, they're literally across the street from each other. So they share a community, they share a neighborhood. How can those institutions and those like them share resources, share services, so that we might avoid closing or even merging, for that matter, so that we can highlight the value of each, but retain them all.
Thanks so much. And Robert, to go back to you, could you talk a little bit about what the federal government currently does to protect students from school closure? To what extent is this system effective, and what could be improved?
Sure. The federal government tries to get a sense of colleges' financial strength with a focus on private, nonprofit, and for-profit colleges. Public colleges rarely outright close because that's a state political decision. They do mergers and consolidations for various reasons, some financial and some that are either political or follow the leader. They see what other states are doing. But for private nonprofits and for-profits, they have measures like financial responsibility scores, heightened cash monitoring, requiring letters of credit, with the goal of having some money there to try to help students and get an early indicator. They're working in conjunction, at least ideally, with accreditors in states on this. The challenge is that the federal government tries to take action by requiring a college to put up money, letter of credit, or through delaying financial aid reimbursement. That could tip a college over the edge, and the federal government doesn't want to do that. So right now, the federal role in closures is relatively limited, at least in terms of effectiveness. And they're hoping that colleges are trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to identify colleges at risk. So, others like accreditors in states who may be more willing to take action will do so.
Thanks so much, Robert. This next question is for any or all of you. How can public policy work to provide more consistent funding to higher education in the long term to avoid some of these financial shocks?
Oh, I'll step out there and see if I can tackle this one first. I think public policy is politics. Anytime that you're talking about anything is just going to throw everything up into a discombobulated state. So I think if there were some specific goals, if you will, that we're trying to accomplish. Long time ago in the dark ages, when I first started education, there were, in the state in which I was, there was a concern that we had enough nurses or enough teachers or enough whatever. And so making sure that our institutions that provide that kind of instruction have the funding for those particular programs, or that the money given to the states to ensure that their state is producing enough people in those particular career fields is certainly one way to do that. To have policies that, have expected outcomes that the money could follow, as opposed to just saying higher education, you have this many students, here's this much money. I think that's why many states have gotten away from FTE or full-time equivalent student funding to having specific numbers that they're giving institutions, saying, here, we need to make sure that you're graduating this many architects, this many engineers, this many automotive technicians, this many, whatever it is that their particular state needs. We've seen institutions change their curricular offerings because of what the states need. In Florida, for example, there are no more community colleges. They're all state institutions, and those that have traditionally been associate degree granting institutions are offering bachelor's degrees, but in specific areas where the state has a need for those particular career fields. And so I think sometimes one way policy could deal with it is to earmark is not the right word, but to identify those needed career fields in their particular state and ensure that funding follows it.
Mm-hmm. I would like to echo Belle's comment about, returning to the value proposition of an institution or the space that that institution occupies as a way to look at policy, but also to, I think, one specific area of strategic funding that institutions really need is around data and data analytics. I think that we would be more proactive facing a lot of the issues our institutions face if we were able to look at the ways that our students are being impacted or moving through an institution before the ball drops. And a lot of that comes with being able to have contextualized good data, and being very specific in funding data collection, analytics, and those positions on campuses. So at our institutions, there are a lot of people who have, 3 or 4 jobs collapsed into one title. However, if we had strategic funding around data analytics and professionals being funded to have those jobs at our institutions, we could see the big picture before it's too late. And I think that is one area that of policy and finance that our institutions could definitely benefit from.
I'd like to kind of tie those two thoughts together with, that I think a lot of these conversations about funding would be easier if just in building public trust around the process and transparency. I think that's where the data analytics comes up. Really, there it is. How are these funds projected to affect students? Where's the outcome coming from all of this? And so it goes back to the whole thing about that amendment from HEA a couple of years ago. Transparency is kind of one of those kind of key terms to all this. This is look at the healthcare industry. We have this discussion over why does it cost X this much to buy this particular drug or whatever it is. And so that's where some of the skepticism comes from, is a lack of understanding of what falls into that, or disagreement as to why that is what it is. But to start that conversation, we need to have the data, and we need to kind of build this shared framework of how to quantify the value proposition of higher education, which is probably the most difficult thing of all.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to be different for every institution. Quantifying it is different and contextualized. Sorry.
Oh, you're good, Andrea. Sorry for the delay. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure we transition to some of the questions submitted by our audience. So first question, Robert, why don't we give this one to you? What sectors of institutional spending have been expanded or curtailed due to the pandemic that are likely to continue post-pandemic? Are we seeing indicators of spending changes in the higher education sector that will persist for years?
It's hard to get a great answer on that because of the way higher ed data ends up being. We'll get the first look at fiscal 20 data sometime about this time next year. And the spending categories we have available are fairly broad. Like instruction is this kind of murky category that includes some instruction, some non-instruction. But I think a big takeaway is investments on technology, that colleges are set up to do more hybrid, more flexible types of classes. Those will continue. And I think reduce spending on almost everything else. I'm watching very carefully for the many colleges that gave pay cuts to employees. Do those cuts get fully restored, or does it take several years for them to get back to anywhere near where they were? So I think less spending on people, less spending on almost everything except for some more on technology.
Thanks, Robert. And here's another question that I think relates back to some of the concerns you raised earlier, Armand. And the question is, how do we provide adequate support and recovery while also ensuring that taxpayer dollars are helping students succeed? Like, what could this accountability look like?
Gosh, I mean, in the short run, it's a really different. In the long run, I would say so take student learning outcomes, right? Like there are a number of nationally normed assessments of student learning, of value added assessment. So how are students progressing in critical thinking, problem solving, et cetera, from year one to graduation? So I mean, that's just it's not a perfect thing, and I wouldn't necessarily tie one particular assessment to here's the bulk of funding. But again, I think it's going to be a longer conversation to get these again defining and how to quantify what the value add, the value proposition is to to what's being put in there. I mean, but we're already doing this at the consumer level, right? Like so. My wife and I just saw a financial planner, and I guess we were told that if we had a child today, we would expect to pay about close to $400,000 to put one child through college, about 18, 20 years from now. So the benefit of the earning capacity of a college degree is about $1 million, but for students who don't graduate, that drops to about 200. So now you gotta ask the question: at a consumer level, is this worth it? And that I think is the scary part, is that the numbers kind of creep up there where it forces that decision.
Thanks so much, Armand. Here's another question for anyone who would like to weigh in. Do you think that there has been a shift in the role of higher education as a result of the pandemic? And do you think this shift might endure?
I think for some, higher education has become even more important because folks still need to get a job, and there are still some industries hiring. And so you've got some pockets of opportunities for students to be able to go back to school to get a credential as opposed to a full associate or bachelor's degree that will allow them to enter the workforce. So I think from that standpoint, it has, but there's no doubt that people are questioning the need for higher ed when there are no jobs available, or when the industry is only slowly growing. And so it's I catch-22. Do I prepare myself while the time is down and the jobs are on hold so that I'm ready to move into those fields once they open back up? Or do I wait and let them open back up, see what the need is, and then go back and get training? And I think that's a big decision that is definitely impacting offerings at higher institutions of higher ed.
Thanks, Belle. And then another question for anyone who'd like to weigh in: to what extent could free college and student debt cancellation proposals help institutions recover from the pandemic? Andrea, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I'd love to take that question. I think it would impact institutions in several ways. The first way that it would impact or help institutions recover from the pandemic is by supporting the students. One thing that we see with UNCF institutions, and we found through our analysis, is that UNCF institutions on average, it's about 65, closer to, depending on the institution, 65 to 90% of their students are Pell eligible. So they serve students who are in dire need of financial assistance. However, that being said, these students within 5 years are no longer Pell eligible. So they have an extreme amount of social mobility after graduating from college. What this equals to, and we have seen this, is high number or high volumes of debt occurred by these students once they're finished with this institution, or they go on to um, professional or graduate school. And so we are seeing a huge wealth gap begin to be created for our students. And so if our students are finding themselves, and therefore HBCUs tend to be, a family tradition, we're going to continue to see the wave of parents and families unprepared to pay for college for years to come if we do not look at debt cancellation or free college as an option for our students. And that will impact the communities that we serve and therefore our institutions. If all of our professionals that we prepare, be it doctors, veterinarians, pharmacists, teachers, you name a profession, if they exit our institutions are not prepared to pay back the debt that they incur by being a part of our educational pathway.
Robert, would you like to weigh in too?
Yeah, so one-time debt cancellation, most of the money would go to students who have already left college. So that's thinking about it a little bit differently. Free college certainly would help the institutions that are included in legislation, but it's an open question as to which institutions will be included. Is it just publics? Are minority serving institutions also included? So it'll be a real food fight about which institutions get included because those would benefit, and the ones that don't get free tuition would be concerned about losing students.
Thanks, everyone. We have one last question before we wrap things up. So let's just go around the horn here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how dire is the financial situation for institutions in the year ahead? We'll start with Armand.
Say 5.5. So there was just an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education yesterday that we haven't seen quite the number or the wave of closures that we predicted a year ago. But there are enough unknowns out there, not just this year, but in the years to come, that if I were a college president, I'd probably add another week to that strategic planning retreat with my board.
Thanks, Armand. Nadrea?
I guess I look at, I'm seeing it so differently. I would say a 9 or a 10. Our institutions were having trouble making payroll and providing facility costs before the pandemic. So it continues to be a dire situation for the institutions that I interact with.
Thanks, Robert.
Last summer, I would have said 10 because colleges got wiped out financially and they didn't know when this pandemic was ending. I'm optimistic at this point that fall will be something closer to normal. So I'd say if last fall was a 10, this fall will be more like a 7 or an 8. Still messy, but at least some of the revenue sources come back.
And Belle?
I'm going to say a 6 only because I have some institutions that are financially strong and I have others that are not, but most of them are in the middle. And so I'm going to lean a little bit to the optimistic side, saying that the federal dollars did help and it's coming back and institutions have been able to salvage what they were doing. So I'm going to keep some of that optimism with a 6, but recognizing that we've got some at 1 and some at 10.
Well, thank you all, and that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for supporting this event. Thank you to our expert panelists for all of their insight, and to the rest of you for tuning in. We hope that this conversation provided some helpful context for the challenges facing the higher education sector in the coming year and a variety of perspectives about what we can do moving forward. So thank you again and have a great day.